Hello and welcome to this video. My name is Jessie and I am an animal artist. Today I'm going to talk through with you how I would paint this blue-winged pitta. So I just start by blocking out the main shapes, and then with my 2B pencil I'll just add in the fine details such as the nostrils on the beak, the eyes, and any details in the wings that I would like to include too. It's quite normal not to get the shapes accurate at first. You'll see me rubbing out the lines over and over again, adjusting and tweaking the shapes and the lines that I draw. So don't be disheartened by that, just keep going. So I'm going to start this painting off by applying the wet in wet technique or wet on wet technique, and it's a natural blending effect. And by applying paint to wet paper or into a wet wash, the watercolour pigments will be able to mix together to produce these really natural, beautiful effects. In a way, no other medium can actually achieve this. So, watercolour is quite special with this wet and wet technique in that it creates these beautiful blends of colours. What's really cool is you can create some natural blends by applying loose drizzles or different colours to the wet paper, and you can allow them to mix and blur together. So as you can see on this bird, for the belly, after applying fresh clean water to the bird, on the belly I put a little bit of cadmium yellow, a tad of cadmium red at the bottom, and then for the wing at the back I've used a little bit of cerulean blue, and I've used some hooker's green as well. And I just literally put the pigment onto the water and it just blends out naturally. Try your best not to interfere with that natural blending and blurring. However, you might need to do a little bit of lifting in this painting in particular because the red part, the red pigment blended a little bit into the blue and I didn't want that. So what I did, I just cleaned my brush with clean water, dry it, and then I just lifted out that watery red pigment from the area that I didn't want to be, and it just soaked it up and it was gone. Now in this painting there'll be a lot of layering. So on the head I've already applied a dark layer around the eye, and I let that dry, and then I applied a second layer on top. So the thing with watercolors, some, not all, can be quite transparent. So the color I put on top, you could slightly see the color below it, so it appears darker. And the thing with watercolor is that when it dries, the color appears lighter. So you can either put a bit more pigment on than you usually would, or you can just layer up on the colors, which is what I do. So on the belly, on top of the cadmium yellow, I'm actually applying some ochre yellow, which is a more of a earthy yellow, and I'm applying that color to more of the shadow areas. And I'm also working in I'm also working on softening edges too. So for the wing on the back, I'm just grabbing some more hooker's green, more pigmented, so less water, more paint, and just adding in some more details on the back. A little bit of a wet on dry technique here. So the back is now relatively dry, and I am applying cerulean blue onto a dried background. So I'm actually working in another layer. So I'm applying some more cerulean blue on top of the wing on the back. And by doing that, it makes the colour appear a bit darker as well. I'm adding in some fine details again with the hooker's green. Understanding tone is really important, and it's essential for making images on a otherwise flat two-dimensional paper look three-dimensional. And we can achieve this by getting the correct distribution of light and shade in them. So overall, the mood to the painting can be established by creating the correct tone and the how dramatic the tonal differences are. So for dramatic tones, the stronger the light source, whether it is from the sun or artificial, the more dramatic the tones will be. So the dark side will appear really dark in comparison to the lighter side. Whereas close tones is where it's not quite dramatic and the light is more evenly distributed across. So in this painting on the belly, I'm creating a tonal difference. So the bottom of the belly is darker than the middle of the belly. So all I've done is added some cadmium yellow to the bottom with a tad bit of amber brown, mixed those together, and that's created that darker tone at the bottom. And then I've blended it out across, leaving a lighter area at the top. And also just under the neck, you can see it's slightly darker there as well. So using cadmium yellow and burnt amber, sorry, not amber brown, burnt amber, we can create a nice darker yellow. And it's also quite nice to use a bit of purple because purple is a complementary color to yellow. So you can use a tad of dioxazine purple on the yellow to create the shadow areas as well. And it's important to soften and blend the edges because you don't want them to be quite harsh. I quite like softening the edges. I think it makes the image look softer, obviously, and more realistic. So a technique I like to use is called wetting the edge. So I will clean my brush, dip in clean water, and then I brush it over the edge before the paint has dried. So if the paint is still wet, I will apply a little bit more water onto the area and just blend it out. Even if it's not wet, if the paint's dried underneath it, the thing about watercolor paper is that when you apply more water to it, the pigment will become soluble again. So I could blend those edges out. Wet and wet edges, so you can tilt the paper enough to allow the paint to run downwards, which this painting I don't do, but it's another really good technique. If you've got quite watery watery paint and you like them to blend, just move the paper around and let that natural mixing occur. For the legs, I use a combination of cadmium red and burnt amber to create a more skin sort of colour. You could also add a touch of alizarin crimson, and then I'm just applying that, making sure I leave highlights. So there's multiple ways you could leave highlights. You could either just leave the area white, which is what I've done. You could use masking fluid to block out those bits of white paper that you want to keep. And then once you finish painting, just rub the masking fluid off because it dries. And then you could use some softening edges technique like the wetting the edge or the wetting wet edges just to blend any harsh edges into the white area. Or one of my favourites, I like to use gouache to add highlights. I tend to use that for the eye a lot, but luckily for this one, I didn't need to use that because sometimes if you work in too much paint or sometimes the paint blends too much or covers a white area you didn't want it to cover, and you realise that pigment has a staining property and it's never going to be as white as the paper again, you can just use gouache to add in that highlight. Going back to tone, around the feet, I'm going to add some shadows. So I'm going to create my own vibrant blacks. I'm going to use French ultramarine with some burnt sienna and perhaps a tad of alizarin crimson. And I'm just going to add that into the shadow areas. So any areas I want to be a little bit darker, so under the wing, around the face, in between, just maybe some separate individual brush strokes for the feathers. And then obviously around the feet as well, like I just said, I'm going to add in that darker colour. In between the toes, I will also add that colour just to create a bit of a shadow, and it makes the image look more three-dimensional. So if you can master shadows and tone, it just transforms your image from something that looks quite 2D to something that looks quite 3D. I like to do a last final check. I just go around, add in some fine details. I also sometimes like to add some darker lines on the edge of the bird too, which I've done quite a lot on the back wing. Just adding in fine little details, tidying things up, softening edges, blending things together until I get to a point where I'm happy. And that's the blue winged pitta. Hope you enjoyed this video and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!